Coach Harper here with High School Sports Performance, and I just want to give people a little bit more insight in what we're looking to do here at HSP. And essentially we are trying to help athletes take their game to the next level, but not just on the playing surface, but also in the classroom as they start to decide what they're trying to do with their careers. We want to separate ourselves from just your traditional strength and conditioning program or strength and conditioning facility, and we want to be somewhere that parents can trust, coaches can trust, and the athletes themselves can trust that they are getting guidance that's going to help them be the best version of themselves. When it comes to sports performance, one of the biggest mistakes that I see, and this is not always due to not caring or not wanting athletes to reach their full potential, but most of the time this is just misguided efforts by sport coaches because they're doing what they were taught, or they're just doing simply the best that they possibly can. So we want to come in and we want to change that narrative. We want to disrupt things, and we want to bring something new to the strength and conditioning field from a high school student athlete standpoint, and we want to help with that performance. There are three planes of motion in the body. We have the sagittal plane of motion, which cuts the body into a left and a right side with the planes of motion extending in front and in back of us. We have the frontal, or also known as that coronal plane of motion, that cuts us into a front and a back side with the plane of motion extending horizontally to our left and our right. Lastly, we have what's known as the transverse plane of motion, essentially cuts us in the middle and to a superior and inferior, or a top and a bottom. I share that with you to say this. When I look at traditional weightlifting and getting an athlete prepared for sport, there are traditional lifts that oftentimes athletes engage in, and coaches have these athletes participate in. Some of those lifts are things like a squat, a lunge, a bicep curl. These are things, even if you're not a fitness fanatic or an athlete or someone who's into sports performance, these are three lifts that likely you've either performed at some point in time, or at least it's something that you have heard of. Those three exercises, though, they take place in that sagittal plane of motion, again cutting us down the middle into a left and a right side, plane of motion extending in front of us anterior and posteriorly. When it comes to sports of all kinds, I don't care if we're playing golf, football, basketball, volleyball, we're cheerleading, athletes have to be able to move in all of the different planes of motion. A squat, as I'm here, and if I were to just simply squat down, that takes place in the sagittal plane of motion. As I'm standing here and say I was to go into a reverse lunge, this also takes place in that sagittal plane of motion. If I'm standing here and I were to do a bicep curl, that takes place in that sagittal plane of motion. I share all of that to paint the picture that many times we neglect other very important planes of motion with our athletes. And we want to come in and ensure that your athletes are being well-rounded and that they are able to move in all different planes of motion. You think about baseball. You have pitchers that have to throw the ball. We think about football. You have a quarterback that has to throw that football. Golfers, if they're here, they're standing with the swing, they have to rotate through their golf swing. We think of a sport like basketball, where you have to be able to move laterally. We have to be able to shuffle side to side in order to defend someone. If I'm a shortstop and I'm moving laterally to get that ground ball, or if I'm a softball player that's trying to get that ball that's a little out of reach, we have to move in these different positions. Basketball players have to jump up in the air and get a rebound. We have to move in different planes of motion. So if we're training outside of our sporting competition to only be one-dimensional and move in one plane of motion, we're greatly decreasing the likelihood that a high school student athlete will ever reach their full potential on the playing field. So we want to make sure that we can come in and get athletes moving in different directions, moving in every plane of motion, not only to increase their sport performance and their play on the field, but we also want to make sure that we're lowering the likelihood of injury to take place. And so if we can do that, we're going to have healthy athletes that understand how to move from a scientific standpoint and will be able to play the best that they can in their competition. Whether they're a multi-sport athlete or they just play a single sport, we are here to help them be able to be the best version of themselves. So sports performance is very complex. Here at HSP, we also want to make sure that athletes understand how to eat. They understand nutrition. At a young age, they're easily influenced. And in this stage with social media and the internet, it's real easy to Google something and get your information that way. Well, though there are some great things that we can find that are reputable sources and are peer-reviewed, many times there are things out there that aren't so great. And at the high school level, whether you're a coach, a player, or a parent, oftentimes that's what we go to, and sometimes we're getting bad information. We want to educate student athletes on protein and the importance of protein in the body. We want to talk about creatine. We want to talk about ergogenic aids and supplementation and get them educated so they can make sure they're doing things safely and they're taking things, if they're going to go that route, that are going to actually help them. And we have to make sure that they're not on any of the banned substance lists, because we see it all the time at the high school level, college level, and professional level. Athletes take things that, whether it's knowingly or unknowingly, that gets them disqualified for competition. For a high school athlete, that can mean losing an entire season. That could be losing a potential scholarship, and we don't want to see that happen to any of the athletes that we work with. Also, we want to separate ourselves because we don't want to just simply help athletes perform on the playing surface from a physical standpoint, but we also want to help them from that mental standpoint. We have a saying here at High School Sports Performance, and it's a play off of HSP, and it's headed straight pro. It's a mindset.